All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I know people are still joining. Thank you all for joining the first webinar in the Horticulture for Development Professional Series on how to find funding and grants for international development activities. This series is focused on providing professional development for researchers, students, practitioners, and others interested in the intersections between horticulture and international development. Webinars are going to be held every Thursday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time through September 19th. As you may be aware, we are offering certificates for the series to participants who attend all 9 webinars. A few housekeeping items before I introduce our presenter. Participants will be muted during the presentation. For any questions you have, please submit those in the Q&A section of your Zoom control bar. If someone asks a question that you would like answered, you can select the thumbs up symbol under that question. We will address questions at the end of the presentation, but feel free to ask those along the way. There will also be a brief survey at the end of the session, and we would greatly value your feedback, so please be sure to complete that at the end of the webinar. Our presenter today is Megan Mayzelle. Megan is a freelance writer and trainer with extensive experience with grants and identifying funding for international and domestic activities. Megan led a multi-million-dollar agricultural and community education project in California and has a very rich presentation for you today. Megan, the stage is all yours.
Thanks, Kyle, and thanks to the Hort Innovation Lab for inviting me today. Just briefly, my name is Megan. I was trained at the University of California, Davis. I've worked as a grant director. I've worked in project coordination and international development, Peace Corps, and as Kyle mentioned, I'm currently freelancing as a writer and facilitator, and I've worked in Asia, Africa, and particularly South America. Today, we're going to be looking at alternatives in grant funding, understanding some grant opportunities, monitoring and evaluating grant opportunities, and writing a grant budget. This is a really rich topic, as Kyle pointed out. So since we only have an hour and a half, we'll be providing additional resources that you'll receive after the webinar is completed. Those will include about 10 pages of resources, documents, web links, and the complete PowerPoint, some of which we won't be getting to today, but that will also cover developing a project plan, writing your grant narrative, and networking as part of your grant success. So let's get started with an overview of funding resources. The main points we're going to be looking at here are whether grants are really your best option, how to plan to use your funding, and understanding that how you use it affects the best way to get it, and then what sort of in-kind resources you might consider, and that those are very important, equally important as money. So let's start with, are grants really your best option? Something that a lot of people don't think about is that grants really narrowly define on what you may spend money and the activities and outcomes of your project. By specifying what you can spend money on and the goals that you will meet by spending that money, grants prevent, to some extent, adaptive program management. They also often don't allow spending on salaries and staff, which of course is crucial to any project. Quick note there, overhead is generally allowed on grants, and we'll discuss that more later. Overhead can be used in many cases to cover some salary components. Grants are also major time investments. The application process is generally very rigorous and time consuming, and reporting and compliance requirements also take a good bit of time to meet. So here's some other resources to consider. These are all in-kind resources, meaning you might not be handed the money, but you'll be handed the resource that you need. If you're considering staffing, particularly in developing country settings, Peace Corps is an amazing resource where you get a college-educated American individual volunteering with your team for a full 2 to 3 year period. Farmer to Farmer is also a great resource if you need, for example, some short-term training or consulting. These are both US government programs and totally free to the community or organization that is benefiting. If you need capacity building for your team, there's many opportunities, including short courses, degree scholarships, and conference attendance scholarships. Again, particularly for developing country members. And there's more information on all of these in the resources that we'll be providing. So here's some other funding resources to consider. If you're looking at a sustainable business model, organizations like Kickstarter, I Fund Women, and Y Combinator are going to be very valuable for you to look at. Kiva provides loans to small startup organizations. And of course, the golden egg is unrestricted funds. That means funding that you can use any way you want. You don't have to report to anyone. You don't have to comply with any restrictions. Those sorts of funds can be acquired, for example, through crowdfunding platforms and through events that you organize that ideally have low upfront costs. For example, if you're a horticulture organization, you might partner with a local restaurant to do a fundraiser dinner. That sort of funding can be great to have as a slush fund for example, salaries that your grant might not cover, even if you do get grant funding. So let's start talking about those grant opportunities. The big points that I want to convey here are the difference between donors, grantors, and implementing partners, the advantages and disadvantages of major and minor grants, and then the key, giving yourself enough lead time on applying for grant opportunities. All right, let's talk about donors and implementing partners. There's kind of two models here. Most of us have heard of the large donors, USAID, UK Aid, World Bank, etc. And these are the big multi-million-dollar grants. These organizations typically give grants to big multinational organizations, for example, Catholic Relief Services, large companies that have a corporate social responsibility arm, and universities. These implementing partners often give sub-grants to collaborating organizations. So if you're a small startup organization, this is where you might become involved with large donors. Typically, you're not going to directly receive a grant. You're much more likely to work with an implementing partner. The second model you'll see on the right side of the screen, small donors, funds, foundations, centers. They typically like to work with small organizations like yours. They're much less likely to engage with multinational organizations, companies, and universities. However, their grant amounts are also much less. So let's talk a little bit more about those major grants. Small organizations. If you're a small organization, you are highly unlikely to win grants directly from USAID or World Bank or any of these other big donors. It's an incredibly time-consuming process. It's very rigorous and it's very competitive. What is a much more productive use of your time in terms of these large donors is to monitor their websites to learn about new big projects happening in your area, and then to network in your region to stay updated on sub-grant opportunities. So that means attending conferences put on by universities in your region, connecting with those large established multinational organizations, and maybe even getting an informational interview or a meeting with some corporate social responsibility individuals at a business. Just being in the loop, building that trust and network in your area. Now for those minor grants, you're much more likely to get these as a small organization. The downside here is that these small donors, these funds, foundations, and centers really rely on trust in your organization, and they often require tax exemptions in their base country. And we'll talk a little bit more about how you can work with that here in a bit. But just for now, the two things that you want to think about are addressing your tax status in that foundation's home country, and again, networking to build those donors' trust and show them the expertise that you bring to the table. So I mentioned that grant application is a time-consuming process, and I've drawn out some time estimates here to give you an idea of what that looks like. You'll see the word networking over and over again here, and it's one of the topics that I won't dig into today since we only have about an hour and a half, but it is going to be in your resources, and it's very important. Before you do anything else, start building connections with partner organizations. You can plan on spending maybe 3 hours a week on this on an ongoing basis. As I mentioned earlier, you want to monitor opportunities, watch for upcoming grants and sub-grant opportunities. The resources that we'll be providing have links where you can do that. This is a pretty low time investment thing, but it needs to be regular. So maybe 2 hours a month until you find a really good grant for you and the partners that you've established through that networking process. Now, developing the project plan. This is where it starts to get intense. If you're working on a new project, you can plan to put about 120 hours on this. If you already have a project happening, you might plan to spend about 20 hours on it. Now, why do you need to spend time on a project plan if you already have a project happening? More than likely, you haven't written down every detail of this project in such a way that you can clearly explain it to someone else in a grant application. So writing out your plan and really articulating where are our strengths, where are our weaknesses, what do we need to do next, why do we need to do that? Those are the sorts of things that you want to think about in a plan in order to convey those accurately in a grant application. Now, you and your staff all have things to do. You can't just put 120 hours all at once on this. That's why I say starting way in advance and giving plenty of lead time is really crucial. You can think about it as 2.5 hours a week for a year, and that's 120 hours. Partners all have scheduling conflicts, so it could get even longer than that. It's amazing how long it can take to get everybody organized. So all that needs to happen before you even start writing your grant application. You can plan to spend, again, about 120 hours on writing. You could think of this as 5 hours a week for 6 months. Again, you and your staff all have other things to do. You probably can't drop it to just write for 120 hours straight. And writing is one of those things that gets better the longer you do it. So if you write it all at once, you might be forgetting something. Spending a few hours on it, stepping away and coming back, you'll really have more time to process how you want to really be convincing to the donors in this case. And this is a little side note. It doesn't always help, but it can be helpful sometimes to submit several days before the deadline. So even give yourself a few extra days there. A lot of times the donors will start reviewing applications that have already been submitted, and if they see that you've missed something, more often than not, they'll get in touch with you and let you know and kind of give you a second chance. Now, if you're submitting at 11:59 on the due date, they're not going to have the opportunity to do that for you. So that's why those few extra days can give you a leg up. As I said, I'm not going to be talking too much about networking today, but let's dig in a little bit more to monitoring grant opportunities. So I want to talk about whether you meet the qualifications to apply and how to figure that out, considering the cost of applying versus the potential benefit, and then understanding the legal status requirements for these opportunities. Again, think 1 year ahead. Most grants recur annually. I talked earlier about those big donors like USAID. USAID announces their annual program statements, or APS, and their business forecasts 1 year in advance. So checking those documents on their website will give you a heads up about what's coming up for you and those implementing universities and organizations. An internet search, international development grants, get on mailing lists, keep a calendar of important dates. This is going to help you know what's coming up for the year to come. And again, that year comes a lot more quickly than any of us expect. So when you do find a grant opportunity, do you qualify? I suggest carefully reviewing the entire announcement. They generally have a description of successful applicants. The keys here are that you meet all of those qualifications and that you can provide evidence that you meet them. If you're not able to do that, it's probably not worth your time applying. In addition to the requirements that the grant explicitly states, you want to think about, does your organization have the staff, the expertise, the time, and the infrastructure to complete the scale of the project the donor wants? This is important. How many people do they want to impact? What kind of change do they want to see? In the time they specify. Do they want it done in a year? Do they want it done in 5 years? With the funding they have available. What you don't want to do is overpromise something that you're likely not going to be able to do. You don't want to under budget your costs. If it looks too good to be true, they're going to be suspicious of your proposal. And you don't want to underspend funds. So that kind of ties into overpromising. You know, if you promise big results and then you get the grant and you don't have the staff or the infrastructure ready and you're going to be scrambling to get all that together, you're not going to, quote unquote, burn the money as quickly as they want you to. For a lot of donors, the burn rate is an indicator of your progress toward the goals that they've set for you. So if they don't see that money being spent, they'll start to get worried that you're not doing anything that you promised. So is this grant worth your time? Let's say you meet the requirements. Do you actually want to apply? Here's some things you can investigate to give you some clues about whether the grant application is going to be worth your time. A quick Google search will give you a good idea of the applicant success rate for this grant. So is it 60%? Is it 2%? Is it 0.5%? That will give you a clue as to how likely you are to win the grant. The first time applicant success rate is generally much lower. A lot of these organizations will perpetually win grants year on year from some large donors. If you've never won that grant before, your chances of winning are much lower than if you've already received that grant in the past. Also take a look at past winners. Are they organizations that are similar to yours? If you're a university, have universities gotten this grant in the past? If you're a small startup in a developing country, have similar organizations gotten this grant in the past? And take a look at the donor organization's values. You know, do they aim to support a small organization? Do they focus on education? You know, what are they about? And are you going to represent them well? That's something they're going to be asking themselves, and it can give you a clue as to how interested they will be in your proposal. So here's some numbers to give you an idea. 17% of applicants on average receive grants, but the difference is huge between small donors and large donors. Now, remember we talked about those small funds and foundations and trusts. They generally give about 20 to 60% of applicants some money. Those large donors like USAID and UKAID only give about 6% of applicants money. 30% of professionally written applications for new donors are funded. So let's say you get the very best person to write your grant application. You've never applied to this grant before. You have about a 30% chance of winning. Now, if you've gotten the grant before, you have an 80% chance of winning. So that shows you how important that reputation and trust with the organization really is. This equation might look a little complicated, but I bet if you write it out, you'll see that it's just basic logic. And it's essentially a cost-benefit analysis. How many hours are you going to spend writing this grant, putting together the plan, networking with partner organizations, monitoring grant opportunities. And then about how much you pay your staff per hour. So essentially the cost of your time, and then the amount of money you could win, how often someone actually wins that, and then again, that new application success rate, 30%. That'll give you a good clue of the potential cost of your application and the potential benefit of your application. And it's up to you how much you want to risk on this, but this will give you kind of a number to go by. So let's get back to that nonprofit and tax status. As I said earlier, a lot of those smaller organizations that are trusts or funds in their home country really need any recipient organizations to have tax registration status in their country. In the US, this is called 501c3. And generally, your organization has to be based in the country in order to receive that nonprofit or tax status. So if you're not based in the US and you want to get money from a US foundation that requires 501c3 status, how do you do that? There's actually a way around it. So the first option is to simply find another grant. Those implementing partners from the large donors actually come in really handy here because they take care of that. They have the tax status, so you don't have to worry about it. Option 2 is to apply for tax status. If you have a branch or an office in the home country of that organization, then you're eligible to apply for tax status, generally speaking. Option 3 is to find a partner organization in your region that can get that status or already has it. The implication here is you will not be the lead organization on the grant application, which means you will not have to deal with reporting and compliance, which is good, but you also won't have as much control over the activities that happen with the grant money. That could be good or not, depending on your specific needs. Option 4, work with a fiscal sponsor. And I should note this applies to USA organizations. I can't speak to European organizations on this, unfortunately. So let's talk a little bit more about that fiscal sponsorship. So in the US, registered nonprofits offer fiscal sponsorship services. There is a link in the resources to a full list of fiscal sponsors and the type of organizations they aim to work with. Generally, the fiscal sponsor will keep about 8 to 10% of the grant award, and that is their payment essentially for being this liaison with the home country tax status. They also, much like a grant application, want to see that you align with their organizational goals, and they'll take care of the reporting and the filing and paperwork. So in a sense, that 8 to 10% is really well spent because that's time that will be saved from your staff in dealing with reporting and paperwork and compliance stuff. Much like general networking, you want to establish a relationship with your fiscal sponsor before you even begin grant applying, perhaps even before you identify a grant you want to apply to. It's a lot about trust. It's a lot about them feeling confident that you will represent them well and that you're going to be a good partner for them to work with. All right, project plan. This is one of the things that we're not going to get too much into today, but the main points are: start now, write it down, acknowledge your blind spots, your issues, and your strengths, and how you're going to deal with those issues when they come up. And then use proven methodologies. There's a lot of project planning resources out there. We'll provide links to many of them in the resources, and those will really help show that you've thought carefully about your project and that you're ready for project success. Writing the narrative. Again, not going to dig into it too much today. You'll see lots of details in the resources. but the bottom lines are closely follow the guidance provided by the donor. Align your methodology with them. If they provide a table for you to use or a template, use it, absolutely. Use similar language as what they use in the grant application. Leverage key resources to offer incredible expertise. So this is where your networking is going to come in handy. Maybe you have a partner organization that is outstanding in, for example, education, or has a well-known researcher on their team. This is where you can really add strength to your application. And again, address your challenges very explicitly. This is not a time to overlook or push aside any issues. The donor is going to be looking for potential problems. So if you call them out and explain how you're going to deal with them, all the better. Now, what I do want to dig into right now is writing a great grant budget. This is a topic that's very challenging for people, so we wanted to make sure to cover it today. We're going to talk about breakdowns, narratives, matching, and overhead. Budgeting from a donor perspective. For the donor, your project success is the most important thing. And the way they see it, money is necessary to ensure that success. So they want this to be a great investment. The budget is meant to be an estimate. It's okay if there are changes after the award. Just make sure you talk about them with your donor. Get donor pre-approval for big expenses. Even if they're described in the budget, oftentimes the amount is $5,000 and over, but it will be specified in the grant stipulations that you definitely want to check before you expend that money. And as I suggested earlier, those large donors do not want money back. They're going to be watching your burn rate. That's, again, how much money you spend across time. It's an indicator of how much progress you're making toward the goals they've set for you. That said, you can sometimes get a no-cost extension. And you, again, want to talk to your donor about this, but that basically means you get more time to spend the money that they've already given you. It could be an extension of the project. Maybe your project is going really well and you haven't spent all the money, so you submit a request for more time to continue the project with the money you've already been given. So what does a great budget look like? A budget should be designed for success, not for low cost. If it looks really cheap, it probably feels too good to be true. They're not going to be convinced that you'll be able to meet the goals that they've set forth with that tiny amount of money. You want to have a very detailed breakdown, good explanations, and plenty of subcategories. So not just staff, but each individual position. If they provide a template for the budget, definitely use that. Avoid round numbers. You know, a 100.00 gives the impression that you haven't thought very much about how much that thing actually costs. Now, if you're dealing with something that has fluctuating prices, you definitely want to go for the upper end of that. For example, let's say you need a tractor and they range from, you know, 10,000 to 20,000. It's probably a good idea to budget toward that 20,000. And you can talk with the donor or include in the budget any ideas you have for unspent funds there. So if we're able to acquire the tractor at less than 20,000, then we'll also purchase 2 plows at approximately 5,000 each, for example. It's okay to budget for unclear potential expenses. You want to identify them, explain why they're not clear, and how you've arrived at the amount you're budgeting for them. And I've alluded to this, but justifications, particularly for higher price items, why it's necessary. For example, if you'll be acquiring a topical expert at $20,000 and someone else who is also a topical expert in that field is available at $10,000, you want to explain why this particular person who costs more is crucial to the success of the project. Read all the rules at least 3 times. Be aware of what you cannot spend money on. For example, a lot of grants do not allow spending on capital, on infrastructure, on advertising, and on salary and staff training. Infrastructure is anything that is permanent, right? A building, greenhouse, that sort of thing. Capital is pretty much anything that costs over $5,000, although some grants define it differently. And it's something permanent and durable. For example, a tractor is a good example. Advertising, I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Salaries and staff training. Grants typically won't cover this, but they definitely expect you to explain how you plan to cover it because they know that you need staff and staff training. In fact, a lot of grants require a specific percentage of matching. So what is matching? We'll talk a little bit more about this on the next slide, but basically it's things that you bring to the table from outside the grant. In-kind matching can be really helpful, so you want to check and make sure that that is allowed or not. So donors really like to see matching. It basically is any other resources that you bring from another grant, from those unrestricted funds. Maybe you had a fundraiser, maybe you have a loan, maybe you have a startup fund. If you're allowed to use in-kind, basically that means anything that's not money but has monetary value. For example, any volunteer work that is contributed to your team, anything you already own that you're going to be using for this project. So you want to show these expenses in your budget, and especially if they're not allowed on this grant, you want to highlight them and show those, focus on those as in-kind matches. And explain in your budget narrative the source of these funds and what percentage of the total project cost is going to be covered by those funds. Okay, let's talk about equipment and infrastructure. If it's purchased with grant funds, generally speaking, the grant will restrict its use to grant activities. So let's say you buy a tractor using your grant funding, they approve that, they allow it. Generally, they'll have some type of percentage of time that it can be used on non-grant activities, non-grant projects. So be aware of that. You're not necessarily going to be able to buy equipment or capital with grant money and then use it for lots of other projects. Now, if you already own it, you could potentially use it as a cost match. You could include it in your grant proposal as matching. And you have to kind of calculate what dollar amount of that item is going to be matching. So you can't just put, oh, I bought this tractor for $10,000, therefore we're matching $10,000. You have to think about how much of the time it is used or will be used for this project, how old it already is, and the initial cost. So for example, you buy a $10,000 tractor. It lasts for 10 years and 10% of the time, so 1 out of every 10 hours it's used for this project. That becomes essentially a $100 per year matching contribution to the grant. And I calculated that $10,000 divided by 10 years is $1,000, 10%, $100. So let's talk about overhead and indirect costs. You might remember at the beginning I mentioned that salaries and staff training are often not allowed on grant funding, but that overhead can be okay. So overhead or indirect, those are synonyms. It means the same thing, overhead and indirect costs. It accounts for all the expenses that are, well, indirect to managing a project. For example, the facilities, the electricity, the pencils and pens in the office, the Wi-Fi, any administrative staff you have that work for all the projects in your office, like a secretary or maybe a general director. These kind of indirect costs are, you can't really specify that they're for this project, yet they do contribute to supporting the project in really important ways. So donors recognize that and allow a percentage of overhead or indirect cost to be added to the grant amount that you request. If you've received indirect before, you generally are going to use the same rate that you have in the past and provide evidence that you received that indirect rate in the past as part of your grant justification and grant narrative. If you've not received overhead and indirect costs before, for example, maybe you're applying to a grant for the first time, or maybe the last time you applied to a grant, you didn't know that you could get overhead and indirect, so you didn't include it. If any of that applies to you, you're going to calculate what percentage of your annual budget, so for your whole organization, goes to general operating expenses. Again, keeping the lights on, supplying the office, staffing those director and secretary positions that just kind of work for all the projects rather than working on one specific project. Calculate that percentage, and that's going to be about your overhead. If that's a lot for you to calculate all that, you can just use 10%, which is the USAID recommended minimum. So just to give you an idea, 10% is very low. It's probably worth calculating your percentage of annual budget. That can range, I've seen overheads of 15%, 30%, even near 100%, shockingly. So it's worth checking. And if you're able to provide that justification in your budget, then absolutely include that indirect cost. So how do you include it in your grant request? The overhead or indirect is not added to your total request. So it's kind of it's a bit of a moving target. So indirect cost base, that means all of your direct costs. So all of the project expenses that you're requesting money for from the grant. So that's called your indirect cost base. Your indirect cost rate, it could be 10% or whatever you calculate. And so to get your indirect cost, you want to multiply the base times the rate. And then add them together. So add the indirect to the direct, and that has to total up the available funds. So let's say they're offering a $10 million grant. Your indirect and direct added together should not exceed 10 million. So you might have to adjust a few things in the direct costs to stay within that limit. You don't want to adjust your indirect cost rate to stay within the limit. Because you've provided that complex justification that you calculated, you don't want to change that too much. You know, it represents your organization and how much it costs to run your organization, but you might need to change some of those direct costs to stay within the available funds for the grant. So what if you don't have a budget template? Well, you want to make some annual budget sheets and then a summary of all of them. Excel is a really good tool for this. We've provided in the resources a few templates as well. I suggest listing each salary or staff position individually. Even if they are not going to be funded by the grant, as I mentioned earlier, it's important to list them there to show what components will be essential to the success of this grant, and then detail how that person is going to be funded. Is it matching? Are they already funded under another project? Are they under overhead costs? Are they a volunteer? What is the value of their time that you are matching to this grant request? Travel. You want to provide a total for domestic travel and a total for international travel, 2 separate lines. Equipment and infrastructure. If known, if you know exactly what you're going to need in terms of equipment and infrastructure, list each one on a separate line and give your best estimate of the cost. As I mentioned earlier, it's probably good to round up a little bit rather than finding yourself short on money later. And if there's possible unknowns, you can group them by the purpose or activity. So for example, you might know you're going to need farm equipment, but you won't have a good idea what farm equipment you need until you get on site with the project. So you might just generally list farm equipment and provide your best estimate of what kind of money you need to get the farm equipment that will be necessary for project success. Events and training. You definitely want to put as much detail as possible here. This is often a point where applicants will overgeneralize, and it is just this big number and there's not a clear benefit to the program. So you want to put as much detail here as possible. Break it down by venue, supplies, speaker, advertising, etc., etc., etc. And expect unexpected costs with events. So again, aim for the higher end of the potential cost, or if you need to include an unexpected cost line and you have an idea what those might look like, you could do that as well. A budget narrative. So this is a separate sheet from the budget template, and you want to carefully reference each item on the budget template and then provide in paragraph form an explanation of what that item is and why it's crucial to the success of the project. Make sure you label the amount, so use the same dollar amount that you used in the budget template, and then the exact wording, you know, whatever the, for example, the name of the title or the item that will be purchased or the event in that budget sheet, so that it's very easy to reference back and forth from the narrative to the budget sheet. Talk about why this expense is very important to project success and where it's going to be coming from. So again, your grant, your budget template and your budget narrative are going to include all costs for the project, not just the ones that you are requesting for this grant. So you want to include anything that's matched, anything that you already own, anything that could be coming from another resource, to demonstrate that you're very committed to the success of the project and you're pulling from multiple resources, not just leaning wholly on this one grant to make it happen. In the budget narrative, you want to be very clear that it is either grant funding or matching. And if it's matching, talk about how you arrived at the dollar value. So, you know, maybe it's staff time and maybe it's volunteer staff time. But let's say you generally pay staff $20 an hour and this person is volunteering 10 hours a week. So that's $200 a week, $800 a month, and calculate that out to a year and explain that in your budget narrative, how you're coming to those matching numbers for any in-kind matching contributions. All right, building networks. Again, something that we didn't talk about too much, but you definitely want to connect with well-established organizations. Make a great impression. Think about meeting everyone's goals and practice listening and learning as much as possible. All right, so I would like to Kyle, can you tell me what kind of questions we have, what we can focus on a little bit more at this point?
Yeah, sure. So one question that came through is just what are some common reasons why grant applications do not get accepted? So if you could talk a little bit more about that, that would be great.
Yes, there are two big reasons that grant applications do not get accepted. The first is that the applying organization does not meet the minimum requirements for receiving the grant. The second is that the grant application is not convincing. They don't trust that you're going to be able to have success, and that could be because the project plan is not clear. It could be because the budget seems too low. It could be because the budget is shady. You know, it's not clear why you're asking for the amount of money you're asking for. It could be because you haven't addressed all the things that they've asked you to address. So again, checking every single qualification and request in the proposal and providing an abundance of detail to really convince that you have thought through this project and you're ready for success are going to be the keys to winning a grant.
All right. Before we jump into further questions, I just want to thank Megan again for your great presentation, and thank you for all of you that have joined this webinar. And I want to pause and just introduce the organizing entity of this webinar and the webinar series. So the Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Horticulture, or the Horticulture Innovation Lab, is a global research network that advances fruit and vegetable innovation, empowering smallholder farmers to earn more income while better nourishing our communities. We are based at the University of California, Davis, and have been funded by USAID for 10 years to conduct horticulture research, and currently have about 22 projects in 14 different countries across the globe. We decided to do this series because horticulture is a critical aspect of addressing malnutrition and obesity, while also creating wealth, especially for women, youth, and other marginalized populations. So over the 9 webinars, including this one, we hope to pass along the lessons we have learned over that time and help build capacity in project management and promote the importance of fruits and vegetables globally. And just introducing myself, my name is Kyle Friedman. I am a graduate researcher with the Horticulture Innovation Lab. I most recently came from RTI International, which is an independent nonprofit research institute. And my group was food security and agriculture. So I've worked on numerous USAID projects supporting food security and agricultural development, predominantly in East Africa. So I'm really excited to be leading this series and engaging with you all in the future and getting to know you a bit better. So we're going to shift to questions that we have from the group. So feel free to be sending those along through the Q&A. One other question that we have that came through is, what is the process of partnering with an organization for fiscal sponsorship look like?
Yeah, it actually looks a good bit like applying for a grant, slightly less formal, and each organization has their own process, but generally speaking, it is, again, demonstrating that you align with their goals and that you're going to be able to represent them through project success. They definitely don't want to, because their name will be on the grant as the lead organization, they're not looking for a train wreck. You know, they want this to go very well. They want to partner with an organization that's ready for project success. So their main questions are going to be about how you're ready to be successful in your project implementation.
Perfect, thank you. Another question that came through, can you provide some examples of indirect costs?
Yes, we talked a little bit about this. Indirect costs are things like keeping your organizational office running, electricity, Wi-Fi, water, it supplies for the office, computers, anything down to pens and pencils. If you have let's talk a little bit more about staff there. If project staff generally is not included in indirect costs, their time is either wholly dedicated to one project or they're split between multiple projects. Anyone that is part of general management of the whole office or the whole organization is part of indirect costs. So for example, the director of the entire organization, they're not generally working on particular projects with any degree of detail. They're managing other staff. So their time is part of indirect costs. Let's say there's a secretary or an administrative assistant that, again, doesn't work on a particular project. They kind of support everybody. They help the staff. They work with the director. They're an essential part of the organization, but they're not working on a particular project. Again, their time and salary and benefits would be part of indirect costs. And maybe that's something I hadn't mentioned earlier. Salary and benefits should be included for each staff position. Indirect or direct costs, doesn't matter. If you're not sure what your benefits rate is, it's pretty easy to calculate. You add up the costs of any benefits they get, right? Like any contributions to retirement, any medical payments, any other programs, whatever those may be, and divide that by their salary. So oftentimes 30% is a good rule of thumb, and you can apply that across all the staff positions that you put on that budget template.
Perfect. Another question, just kind of going back to the beginning, is what would an initial step be for a very new organization applying for a grant that maybe hasn't applied for one before? Kind of before most of these steps, kind of where do they start to get involved? So I'm going to jump back. Would it be worthwhile to dig into networking right now? Sure. Okay. Let me fiddle a little bit with this and pull out some extra slides. So to answer your question in brief, if you're a very new organization, the very first thing to start doing is networking. Sort out what other organizations are working in your region and connect with them. How do you do that? Especially if they could potentially be a competing organization, someone that maybe your staff could potentially quit and go work for them, let's say. You don't want them to view you as competition for sure. You want to be partners because more than likely each of you have strengths and issues that you can address together. So the best way to probably go about that is to ask for an informational interview. And really an informational interview is about listening. So the reason networking is going to be your secret weapon as a new organization is because most people don't do it. We're generally understaffed, busy, and we have project goals to meet. So why would we spend time just chatting? There's no tangible output. We're already stretched thin, and it's not urgent. It's never urgent. But the truth is, networking gives you a huge advantage, and a good network will become your greatest asset in applying for successful grants. All right. Another question that came through is just, are there restrictions for different groups or organizations to apply for a grant? For example, LGBTI groups. I don't know that there's restrictions for example, for LGBTI groups to apply for grants, but the grant announcement will definitely talk about what a successful applicant looks like. So for example, they might talk about universities, they might talk about
a research organization. They might talk about what sort of staff you have available. They might talk about your history. They could say they're looking for people that have an established history of working with USAID or an established history of working in country X. So those sorts of things are going to be the main qualifying points that you want to look for when you're considering whether you're going to be a successful applicant or not.
Another question that we have is, what are some strategies for having final applications reviewed? So when you put together your proposal, you have your grant, you have your budget, you have your narrative, and you feel like you're pretty sure that you're ready to submit, do you have any strategies for kind of the final review process before you pull the trigger and send that off to the donor?
So there's kind of two options there. If you're writing this yourself, having all the partners look at it is going to be the ultimate review process. In fact, it will likely take a good bit of time to get everybody on the same page and happy with what is being said in the application. It's probably a really good idea after all that is done to pull in some external person, perhaps they're on your team, that hasn't been involved in this. Have them go through the grant announcement and highlight every important piece of information, everything that should be included in the grant application, all the qualifying characteristics. Are you a university? Do you have exempt tax status, et cetera, and then ask them to read your grant proposal with a fine-tooth comb and make sure every single highlighted point has been addressed, right down to the budget template and the project planning. That's going to be the best way to make sure you've addressed everything. The second option is to work with a professional grant writer. They will really make that's going to be their main goal, is to make sure that you're addressing every single point in that grant proposal. And most grant writers are going to want to be part of the process from the beginning, but you may be able to find a grant writer that's willing to just review your application for a smaller fee than what they would normally charge. While we're talking about that, it might be useful for you to know, if you're considering hiring a grant writer to do this, it is generally not legal to pay the grant writer out of the grant that they are applying for. That's a really good example of when unrestricted funds, let's say money that you got from a fundraiser, come in handy, because you need some money to pay this grant writer. You have to pay them whether they win the grant or not, and you're not allowed to legally pay them out of the grant. So you have to have some money somewhere else to pay them, and you have to prove that you were able to pay them for that.
Great. So getting into kind of post-submission type questions, what are some scenarios of the review process from the donor side? So you make the submission, you're kind of waiting around. Do donors often come back with questions? And then maybe what does that process or period look like?
Generally speaking, they're going to do an initial review and throw out any applicants that don't meet the minimum requirements. This is why this is why it's worth just determining whether you meet those requirements before you ever even start writing an application, because you could spend hours and hours and hours and hours on this, and it will get thrown out if you don't meet those minimum requirements. It won't even get read. So definitely make sure that you meet those before you start. Generally, they're then going to do kind of a round-robin process with multiple people reviewing the qualifying applications and kind of paring it down bit by bit to 2 or 3 that are most competitive. Sometimes they will split the award between multiple organizations if they're not able to decide. If you're lucky, they will come back to you with questions. If you get questions, it means that you look very promising and maybe there's one little thing that they need clarification on. Some organizations have a strict policy of not doing that. They will only rely on the information you provide in your proposal, which is why more is better always. But there are some that will come back to you with questions, and that's always a great sign when they do that.
Great. And do you find that all funders give feedback on rejected applications?
No. Most large organizations have a policy against that because it would just be an overwhelming task for them. Some of the smaller trusts, you might be able to request that, but generally speaking, I would say you're not going to get clear feedback on what you could do better next time.
And for different types of individuals applying for USAID funding specifically, there's a question of, can faculty members apply for USAID funding from various countries?
The faculty member individually, or?
Yes.
USAID is almost never going to give a grant to an individual. I think, as we discussed a little bit earlier, let's pull that back up. Here. Those large donors are almost always going to look for an implementing partner. In Washington, D.C., we affectionately call the implementing partners the Beltway Bandits because they get the grants over and over and over and over again. They definitely have that 80% advantage of being a multi-time awardee for the grants. Oftentimes universities can get in on this. Corporate social responsibility is getting really big. Organizations like TechnoServe, they're going to probably win. An individual, I would say, look toward those small donors. A faculty member at a university could also have the additional challenge of, are they representing the university or are they representing themselves? And you may have to address in your justification any restrictions that the university has on you working as a freelance individual. That's almost certainly going to be a question on the part of the organization is, are you allowed to be doing this? Are you allowed to have this money on the side in addition to your full-time appointment as a faculty member?
Right, yeah, and for USAID funding specifically, obviously, we can't speak for USAID, and those are specific questions that would have to be addressed with the donor, as well as just being really clear on reading the RFP or the release that they put out. So making sure that the instructions that are included in that. Another question that we have is just in terms of the type of different projects, does this process in terms of finding funding and going through proposals seem to apply pretty uniformly to, say, an infrastructure type project versus a more research scientific focused project or application?
That's a good question. Yes, generally speaking, this process will apply. A research focused, the budget is going to be significantly different, obviously, but also your approach to the budget is going to be significantly different because you have a lot of intangibles on a research project, a lot of staff, a lot of unclear expenses, that will likely come up in the field, whereas an infrastructure project, you have pretty straightforward costs that you can list, and they're all going to be pretty big. So your budget is going to look a lot less complex than a research project budget.
Awesome. Another question is just back to budgeting, that sometimes there might be restrictions around funding salaries or personnel, and if you have any examples of how you might be able to allocate for staff time without maybe directly including that as a line item, or how to go about that if there are restrictions on salaries or staffing?
Yeah, so as I said, then this is worth reiterating. The donor recognizes that you have to have staff, and yet staffing is often not allowed as a grant cost. So you definitely want to include staff and all other expenses that will be crucial to project success in your budget. Even if you're not asking for grant money to cover it, where it's coming from and its role in the project is really crucial. So it should be in that budget. And that's your opportunity to explain where you're going to be funding from for that position. For example, you might, if let's say you're based at a university, you might have a small amount of funding from the university to pay for a couple positions, and you're using that money to pay for some staff for this project. Or let's say you're getting into something new with this project and you need to train your staff in some specific aspect of the project, and you've gotten a scholarship for them to go to a conference or complete a program, a training program. You want to include that scholarship as matching funding. We talked earlier about the indirect costs of a director or an administrative assistant that maybe don't work directly on the project but support the project in significant ways. You can include a percentage of their salary and time as matching on here. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think
Okay.
That's great. Another question is just in terms of applying for multiple grants from different donors. In the event that maybe you apply for two that are from two different donors and you get both, are there any consequences for being able to work on both, or since they're different donors, there's not really any conflict?
Is this for the same project?
Different projects. Different projects, different donors.
Yeah, there's no implications, no negative implications there. And if anything, I think having received grants in the past supports your request to get more in the future. You know, that you have successfully managed a grant before definitely supports you in getting more grants. Perfect.
Another question is just about if local NGOs from post-conflict countries may be able to apply for government funds.
Like USAID funds?
Yeah, for example.
Okay, so let's get back up to that little image we were looking at earlier. So a small organization is going to be here in the collaborating organizations, or over on the right side as an implementing partner. Again, you're rarely going to be able to get money from those large donors, like the government donors like USAID, UK Aid, and World Bank. It is much better use of your time to monitor those opportunities and network in your region with the implementing partners that could be receiving that government funding, so that you could potentially become a collaborating organization. That is not only a great way to get your project funded, it's also a great way to build your reputation and grow your organization. You know, by working with these really well-established multinational organizations or large businesses or universities, you start to bolster your own organization, and you could be one of those implementing partners someday.
Great, thank you. Another question was, I think this is specific to a particular donor, but looking at the FAO, do you have kind of examples of them funding grants in particular for agriculture, which I think tends to be pretty common, but I don't know if you have specific comments on that.
Yeah, so the FAO definitely falls into that large donor category up top. They will tend to fund, for example, implementing partners like CGIAR, you know, the International Agricultural Research Consortium, Catholic Relief Services. One Acre Fund has gotten into that implementing partner category. That's a great example of an organization that has moved from the small collaborating organization category up into the implementing partner category. Yeah, so FAO is definitely funding, but again, funding those implementing partners, and that's a great opportunity as a small organization to connect with them if they're working in your region and starting to bolster your reputation and your capacities by collaboration.
Great. This isn't necessarily a question, but I just want to clarify that we're sort of going through, and Megan's sort of going through a higher level process for identifying grants and funding for different activities and what that process looks like. So it's not necessarily specific to just horticulture projects. It could be other agriculture, it could be education and kind of outside of agriculture. So I think a lot of what has been presented is applicable to numerous types of projects in different sectors.
Yes, I would echo that. This is going to be generally applicable to community development, grant acquisition, and funding.
Great. Another question I think we've answered maybe a little bit already, but is just can individuals apply for example, USAID or UKAID or other government funds? And I know you've answered that, but maybe just reiterating the whole implementing partner type relationship.
Yeah, so again, an individual, I'm not saying you can't apply, but I wouldn't recommend it. It's probably not going to be a good use of your time to apply for government funding. In fact, if you look at the minimum qualifications for almost any grant, you'll probably see that individuals will not qualify. An individual is much more likely to qualify for a small donor grant, and even then, generally speaking, I think donors are looking for an organization that has established itself and has capacity to implement a larger project.
Great. Another really good question that came through is just when there are so many different organizations in the development space and trying to access funds from donors, whether that's, there's a conference and a lot of people are trying to engage with those donors or other events, do you have sort of strategies to be able to kind of get through the crowd and really be able to establish that network and build that rapport?
Yeah, that's a great question. Let's talk a little bit more about networking. This comes up over and over again, and you would think grant applications would be very cut and dry and that there wouldn't be a lot about people, but it really is all about people at the end of the day. Let me get back down to my networking slides. Oh, here it is. Perfect. The benefits of networking. And I realize the question is about networking when an organization is already highly sought after, and I will definitely circle back to that. Let's just establish a little bit more information about networking first. So by networking, you become a favored applicant, essentially. You hear about grant and sub-grant opportunities. And again, sub-grant is when you get some money from an implementing partner to work as a collaborating organization. You learn about those opportunities by talking to people. It's striking how organizations silo themselves in the field simply because they are already overstretched and they don't have time to do anything but the most urgent and essential stuff. So maybe it's your director that's going to be doing this, but partnering is super important. And in order to partner effectively, you really have to be aware of what your strengths are. What are your capacities? What are your expertise? What can you offer this organization? Also, what are your issues and weaknesses? Where could you use some help? What can they do for you? Partnering in fundraising efforts is super productive. I alluded to this earlier with, a horticultural organization partnering with a local restaurant for a fundraiser. That is a great way to get your name out there to people that frequent restaurants, which is most of us. It's an awesome way to identify fiscal sponsors, just talking to them, figuring out who you have a good connection with. Expert project advisors are really important on grant applications. They might not do a lot, but just their expertise and oversight of the project is very reassuring to the donor. So by networking, you identify these people. You know that one person that knows everything about your particular topic in your region, in your country. They've been working there for 20 years. They are, maybe nobody knows their name, but they just know what they are doing. Having that person on your advising team for your project is a huge win. So taking time to get to know those people and build their trust and build a connection with them is an awesome way and an awesome benefit of networking. Networking helps you avoid reinventing the wheel or reinventing a square wheel. If someone else has already done something that did not work, this is a great way to avoid making the same mistake. It's also a really good way to figure out how you're falling short, what you haven't considered yet. It uncovers those things when you talk to other organizations. And I alluded to this earlier, but networking is not asking for anything. It's not saying, what can you do for me? It's connecting with people personally, making a good impression on them, and then listening to them, asking good questions, learning about what their organization does, what kind of challenges they've faced, what kind of square wheels they've invented, and what kind of round wheels they've invented. And then you start thinking about meeting each other's goals and how you can make that easier on each other, right? That's where a sustainable network comes into play. If they are overstretching themselves to help you and do you a favor, that's not going to last. But if they're getting something from you and you're getting something from them, and it's easier on both of you because you're working together, that is a sustainable partnership. And that is a strength that you can bring to your grant application. Again, networking is none of these things. It's not asking. It's not you talking at them. It's not you advertising your organization.
So shifting gears a little bit to a particular audience that we might have on this webinar for students. So
Sure.
Can you talk a little bit more about opportunities for students to get engaged in some of these projects, whether it's getting engaged with an implementing partner, being able to work on sort of a larger USAID, UKAID type of project? What are opportunities for students?
Great question. For students that are at university level, many universities have an international programs office or any type of community service organization on campus. That's going to be the best way to start to get involved. Most students are going to find themselves volunteering initially. Some organizations do have paid internships, and I'm thinking specifically of CGIAR right now, just because it's in the international realm, and I've seen several internships come up from them recently. And we talked about this at the very beginning with the non-grant funding resources. So these two things, the Peace Corps volunteering and Farmer to Farmer, are awesome ways for students to get engaged with grassroots organizations. If you've never considered doing either of these, obviously it's two very different lengths of time in terms of commitment. Farmer to Farmer is a US government organization. It's implemented by several large implementing partners, including Catholic Relief Services, among others. I think ACDI VOCA also does some Farmer to Farmer. It tends to be a 1 to 3 month commitment. All your costs are paid. You're not going to be getting an income, but you're going to get a really cool opportunity to be in the field. It's actually a great way if you're interested in freelancing to start getting into that, because it's a very similar model to freelancing in that you apply, you're selected for your expertise, your costs are covered, and you work in the field for a short amount of time and then step back out again. So you might be doing something like instructing a farm or organization Or you might be doing something like solving a specific issue they have, let's say irrigation infrastructure or irrigation efficiency that they're struggling with in their cooperative or in their region of the country. Peace Corps, I think more people are familiar with, but essentially it's a 27-month commitment. It can be extended. They work in 5 different sectors of community development, one of which is agriculture. It can be done in coordination with a master's, which has its advantages and disadvantages. And it's really, if you're interested in working in community development, it's the ultimate ticket to being well respected and qualified in that field. And Peace Corps now allows you to express preferences in terms of what country you go to and what program you work in, which is new. I know that some people were deterred by the previous model of worldwide availability, and so this has really allowed people to hone in their goals and aims for their service.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that from my experience. I think communicating with the organization that is implementing whatever project you're looking at and interested to be a part of or support in any way is kind of the first step. So there might be restrictions depending on availability of funds in their budget, but I think it never hurts to reach out and see what opportunities there might be. And usually the implementing organizations can help you navigate that, and also often have ideas for ways that you may be able to support. So I think it never hurts to reach out and start that conversation with a project that you might be interested in working with if you're a student.
Absolutely.
Another question is about realignment. So say you've received a grant, you've celebrated receiving that grant, and the situation of maybe what you're planning to implement changes a little bit. Yes. So on the topic of realignment, kind of how do you go about realigning? Is that allowed?
That's a great question. And it was one of the first things I mentioned in this presentation is that, grants really narrowly define what activities you can spend money on and what outcomes you need to get out of your project. And that is a true challenge with grants is, you've won the award to do a certain thing and you start to see the circumstances on the ground changing. You want to change along with them, but your agreement with the donor of the grant maybe doesn't allow for that. So the specific answer to this question is going to vary considerably based on the donor. USAID, for example, is well known for really keeping to those initial requirements. Some of the smaller organizations are going to be a lot more flexible. In all cases, it is about communicating carefully with your donor. A lot of times that you can really distill down what are the specific outcomes that they need and how you can meet those maybe in a different way than originally planned while still successfully adapting your project. So it's going to be a case by case, it's going to be a conversation, it's going to be some creative thinking. That said, it is extremely valuable and important to adapt to what's happening on the ground and making sure you're truly offering benefit and that your project is successful in the true sense of the word, not just doing what you were supposed to do on paper. So it's always worth the effort to find a way to meet everyone's goals and interests.
Great. And continuing on the topic of students, say you have maybe a PhD student or a master's student in another country where certain programs may limit their participation. Do you have any examples of international students and how they may be able to get involved? Great
question. Do we know what country we're talking about?
Not particularly, no, just in general.
I would kind of defer to what Kyle mentioned in terms of reaching out to the organizations that are doing the sort of work that you're passionate about and interested in and looking for how you can engage in that. Again, you're more than likely going to be volunteering to begin with. However, it's part of networking, right? To establish a reputation and build trust. And more than likely, when that organization is looking to hire, you will be the first one on their list because you've proven yourself to be very helpful to them. It's worthwhile to consider both those implementing partner organizations as well as the smaller local collaborating startup sort of organizations, and take a look at the advantages and disadvantages of both. The smaller organizations are more likely to offer you something, you know, when you just contact them off the bat. They're more likely to let you just walk into the office and have a conversation with them. Some of the larger guys are going to be busier, but you know, it's also worth getting into that and seeing how big organizations work. So it's all about your goals as an individual and for your career as to which you focus on.
Awesome. And going back to a previous question that was asked in terms of an organization or a project receiving funds from two different donors, I think we were sort of addressing that question as more of an organization has applied for two different grants for two different donors, and there's nothing precluding that. I think if we're talking about an organization has received a grant with funding from two different donors, I think that's often a different scenario. And if you have input you want to provide, Megan, feel free. I've had experience with a joint USAID and a UK aid funded project, and there weren't really any issues with that, and it does exist. Often the funds that you receive from that particular donor are earmarked or need to be used for a particular part of your implementation and activity, and often the implementing partner of that activity needs to very explicitly be tracking the use of those funds and what they're going towards. So it's not necessarily uncommon that you might have a project with funds from two different donors. It's just being very clear as to what those funds can be used for, tracking that, and then you know, oftentimes just understanding which role those donors are playing in that project. I don't know if you have follow-up comments to that.
Yeah, so what I'm maybe hearing, or maybe something just to add there, if you're requesting funds from two different organizations for the same project, I would raise a red flag if you were applying for them to cover the same costs at the same time, because if you were to get both, then somebody's going to be not happy about that. If you're applying to both simultaneously, ask for funding for different things so that if they both fund you, it's complementing each other and supporting each other rather than you ending up with twice the amount of money you actually needed. If you've already gotten one and you're applying for the second, obviously you want to apply for things that aren't already covered by the first. And the first grant is matching. Definitely document what it's going to be covering as matching for the second application. So let's say USAID has given you $1 million. That's $1 million in matching that you can offer UK aid when you're applying to their grant, just as an example.
Awesome. Well, we are almost out of time. I'll just ask one last question before we close, and this is I think an interesting and fun question to end on, but the question is, do you have to have a very catchy and interesting project title for your grant? Is that necessary? And maybe also when in the process assigning a title for a project actually happens?
That's a great question. Seems like all projects really like funny acronyms. So if you found something that was not an acronym, I bet that would be really catchy. I have seen that the important thing of a title is for your team to rally around the project, you know, that have an identity. That's really the most important part of it. As far as the application, it won't affect anything unless the name is of a nature that it would, like, they would be worried about the reputation to fund something with that name. So, you know, just make sure it's not doesn't raise any flags in terms of cultural sensitivity and etc. Other than that, it should just convey what you want to do and be something that your team can identify with.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you again, Megan, for the presentation. Thank you to all the participants who have attended. I know people have joined from various countries and various time zones, so we greatly appreciate it. Just a couple of reminders. This was, again, the first webinar of a 9-part series, and I know many of you are looking to get the certificate, so you will need to attend all 9, and we appreciate many of you have already indicated interest in that certificate. The next webinar will be held next Thursday, same time, and we look forward to you joining that. If you have any questions, please feel free to email horticulture@ucdavis.edu, and we can address those questions for you. Thank you for joining.